Hi, I'm Anne Rieselbach, the LEADS Program Director. Welcome to this month's FF Distance Edition, featuring the work of Elizabeth Kennedy, landscape architect. We're zooming today from the site of one of Elizabeth's projects, the Weeksville Heritage Center. Located in central Brooklyn, Weeksville is a historic site and cultural center, the latter designed by Caples Jefferson architects, that uses education, arts, and social justice lens to preserve, document, and inspire engagement with the history of Weeksville, one of the largest free Black communities in pre-Civil War America. Dr. Ray Codrington, the President and Chief Executive Officer of Weeksville, will provide a short introduction to Weeksville's architecture and programs after this first round of introductions and thank yous. The FF series is an online reinvention of the League's in-person First Friday receptions, tours, and project reviews. Like First Fridays, these programs provide the opportunity to both see recent and current projects, as well as get a sense of where and how firms are working. This season, we are featuring design practices that are redefining the public landscape by responding to social and environmental concerns and exploring the intersections of architecture, technology, and ecology. Today's program moderator, Justin Garrett Moore, is the inaugural program officer for the Humanities in Place program at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. His work focuses on advancing equity, inclusion, and social justice through place-based initiatives and programs, built environments, cultural heritage projects, and the commemorative spaces and landscapes. His experience in architecture planning and design ranges from urban systems, policies, and building projects to grassroots and community-focused planning, design, preservation, public realm, and arts initiative. Notably, during his recent 5-year tenure as the Executive Director of the New York City Public Design Commission. Justin is an adjunct associate professor of architecture at Columbia GSAP, and in 2021, he received the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Architecture and was named to the United States Commission of Fine Arts by President Joseph Biden. Following the presentation and Justin's conversation with Elizabeth, and the two are going to be intertwined today, I think, pretty much. The discussion will be open to all attendees, and you can post your questions in the Q&A section. Please use that area and not the chat section. Before we begin, a quick thanks to the League sponsors. This program is supported in part by the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, as well as by the League's members whose annual support makes all of our programs and events possible. Please visit archleague.org for further information about membership and the League's upcoming events, as well as past programs. Finally, towards the end of this program, information will be posted in the chat section for how to get CEUs. Now on to short introduction to Weeksville from President and CEO, Dr. Ray Codrington. Dr. Codrington has conducted ethnographic research across the US and UK, studying race, Blackness, equity, hip hop, popular culture, and civic engagement. His career has included developing programming focused on urban expressive culture for the Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs and the Mayor of Los Angeles, and serving as the founding director of the Julian C. Dixon Institute for Cultural Studies in Los Angeles. Most recently, he served as executive director of High Arts in East Time.
An opportunity for you to go out and use your 5 senses to understand and experience Weeksville. Aside from doing the tour and hearing the history of the actual homes, you'll also have a chance to walk around the grounds and talk to each other.
I love how your burgundy branches have abstract lines and your green leaves are so sublime. The fall has arrived and you seem to notice that was fall's motive. You are so beautiful and cool, I can't stop thinking of you.
Talk about what a Black space is and how meaningful Black spaces have been for you. Define a Black space for yourself between adults and students.
Dear Wood and Bench, the different types of woods amazes me. The different angles add a fascinating mystery. The angles look like curves as I look closely to observe. Your texture is amazing. It has different patterns. It has a meaning that matters.
You'll do a rubbing, and what a rubbing is you take a piece of paper, you put it on a surface, use crayon to rub over it so you can see the texture of it. You'll also write a love letter. You'll find something on the landscape or even outside of the homes.
Dear dresser, I have looked at you for a while. I have admired your beautiful carvings and your purpose. Your carvings tell a story. It reminds me of how creative Black people were. I love you and cherish your drawers. They open and close while they keep my clothes tight. Oh, your wonderful mirror helps me see my reflection. I love to spend time with you every morning. Your beautiful knobs, your carvings tell a story, a beautiful story. Continue on.
You'll face the sun and select the time when everyone on the team will face the sun for 60 seconds. And just think about what do you feel, what do you hear, and write it down. Elizabeth talked about the landscape of the site and was very strategic in how the natural landscape sort of accompanies the building and creates this environment.
When I stepped into the house, I felt like I was the one who was living in the 1860s. Thank you for leaving this legacy for us.
Lovely.
Sincerely, Team 4.
Okay, all right, Team 4. Okay.
Greetings. Thank you for the introduction. Again, my name is Dr. Raymond Covington, and I'm the President and CEO of Weeksville Heritage Center. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, staff, and supporters, I welcome you to Weeksville. I hope you enjoyed the introductory video. It captures our site and our programs and the essence of our work so well. We do have other videos, but this one seems especially appropriate today. It was done by Black Space, an organization that brings together, quote, planners, architects, artists, designers, as Black urbanists, people who are passionate about the work of public systems and urban infrastructures. And the video was actually first introduced to me by Justin Garrett Moore. Black Space does fantastic work, and I thank them for letting me show the video, so I did get the okay from them. More generally, let's ground ourselves in this space. Weeksville, as an historic community, was founded as a free Black community in 1838. It was established based on the radical question around what happens when Black people explore freedom in ways that are unencumbered by racism. Weeksville was a racial equity and social justice project that was ahead of its time. The ideas of community engagement and institution building have always been at the center of Weeksville's existence. Its founding and subsequent evolution was a radical act 11 years after the abolition of slavery in New York State. This was not a remarkable vision, right? We all deserve freedom, not think it's an inalienable right. But in many ways, it was remarkable that freedom became a reality for Black people here in Weeksville. The presence of our ancestors looms large here, and I feel this presence every day. So there's definitely a tangible and an intangible presence that can't be felt through Zoom, but trust me, it's here. When you visit Weeksville, you experience a 360-degree view of Weeksville. Our site holds over 180 years of history, starting with Hunter Fly Road homes, which date back to the mid to late 19th century. The rediscovery of these homes and community-driven campaign to save them and have them designated as landmarks in the late 1960s, to the establishment of the Society for the Preservation of Weeksville and Bedford-Stuyvesant History, which is our official name, a little over 50 years ago, to the opening in 2014 of the building we are presently in, and finally to the emergence of Weeksville Heritage Center as a member of the Cultural Institutions Group 2 years ago. It's been quite a journey, and this journey continues. The focus oftentimes is on the houses, which are obviously incredible. But as we all know, the landscape architecture here is also compelling. I have a story. Internally, we were thinking about having a gala here. And we talked about making the meadow, which is a small hill outside, talking about how to make that flat so that we could put chairs and erect a tent on the meadow. I thought about it, something felt a little off about the idea. So I broached the topic with Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth is extremely measured, in my opinion, but let's just say the idea fell on deaf ears. I got the impression that this suggestion was the equivalent of nails on a chalkboard for Elizabeth. But this was a turning point for me, and I got it. I understood the role of the landscape in Weeksville's story, which speaks to the ways in which the historical significance of the land, space, and the built environment are indelibly linked here at Weeksville. Here, the landscape pulls together the entire site. It is a conduit between the historical and contemporary. The deliberate and intentional ways that these links are made is a credit to Elizabeth's skill and vision. Weeksville Heritage Center would not be what it is without this keen eye and sense of history. The landscape also allows us to engage our community and work as it is one of the most interactive spaces for presentation and engagement. With that said, it is a sincere pleasure to have you all here. Elizabeth and Justin, I look forward to hearing the conversation, and once again, welcome everyone to Weeksville Heritage Center.
Great, thank you, Ray, and thank you, Anne. So I'm Justin Garrett Moore, and want to pause for a sound check here. Want to thank everyone for joining us for this lunch talk. So Elizabeth Kennedy Landscape Architect, EKLA, was founded in 1994. Black-owned and women-run, EKLA is the longest surviving such firm in the country. Its longevity is intrinsically tied to the tenacity of the firm's principle and her belief in the importance of service to clients, to the community, the emerging professionals she trains, the profession, and the process of design. The majority of the work they do is mission-driven. Since the firm's inception, their work has quietly challenged mainstream assumptions about the aspirations and needs of underrepresented voices. Systems and biases have long dispossessed the less powerful of spaces and rendered the people who have used them invisible. EKLA is best known for work that counters this invisibility. Their projects at the intersection of social justice and design exemplify landscape architecture's potential to engage a broader critical understanding of place and identity. Elizabeth is this year's recipient of the Landscape Architecture Foundation Medal, honoring a career of distinguished work in landscape sustainability. It follows her 2021 elevation to the ASLA Council of Fellows. She got the F on her ASLA, and recognizes her efforts to lead projects that intersect cultural heritage and ecological sustainability. Deemed as an exceptional leader, visionary, entrepreneur, and advocate for social change, designer, teacher, and mentor to young professional women and BIPOC designers. Her decision to certify EKLA as a minority and women-owned business enterprise opened the door to public work. She considers it a calling. Her teaching studio business model delivers solid, thoughtful work through rigorous on-the-job training. People who have worked at the firm have been immersed in historic landscape preservation, sustainable site design, green roofs, green infrastructure, site construction, and landscape management. These are all expertise that they use to interpret the complex aspirations of people who don't often have the voice or feel empowered to have a say. So really excited to have this conversation, to see some of your work, Elizabeth, and then continue the conversation.
So, well, to be honest with you, I'm missing the iPad. I was looking forward to that. But first of all, thank you, everybody at the Architectural League for, first of all, asking, and you pursued me quite some time to get me to agree to this. And Dr. Codrington Ray, that was so moving. And I'm so glad that Justin agreed to do this, because we've been having a sort of ongoing conversation now for about 6 to 9 months, really, about this practice and practices like it. Because we are thought about as unusual, we're not unique. I want to put that out there, just in case somebody somewhere is saying, well, we do that too, right? But I'm also very proud to be here, and I'm proud to showcase Weeksville first, because this project has been my PhD. it has been the project that actually clarified everything that, first of all, I set out to do as a young designer. When you have a fantasy about a project, I once told somebody that if I never get another chance to design something, that I feel that Weeksville is my thriller, you know, like the project that sort of defines everything. It also has been one of the most rewarding. I think it in its both simplicity and complexity, we'll talk about that in a second, that it achieves so many things so directly without a lot of artifice. And there was a question about, which we go into about our approach and methodology. So even Weeksville made us really focus on what it is that we do and what it is that, and how it is we work with clients like the center and others. So if we could get to the first slide. I wanted to say that I wanted to start with this because, first of all, we're hiring out there, you know, but the other issue is that I do have a different approach to the business side of practice, and this statement that I've always thought of my firm as a place where people come into their own by doing thoughtful, necessary work is really a key sort of, I would say, ethos and almost mantra here. When people come to me looking for a job, particularly if they're beginning their careers, I'm looking at their gifts more than their skill set, because I believe that the skill set will come, but the gifts are the things that when you come to EKLA, we try and pair those gifts with our clients' needs. So we give a lot of responsibility right away. People are often shocked by that. We throw everybody in the deep end because we also try to make sure that our projects are sort of buildable, and in most cases it's not that they're not technically demanding, but they're not over designed and overbuilt and such. And this allows emerging professionals to put their hands on important issues very, very quickly. So this is part of, frankly, it was the way I was trained, and it's the way we continue our tradition. And it's the way that many Black and Brown practitioners historically have brought their farm teams along. I want to call it that way. You have to grow the talent that you need, particularly systemic bias is still very much a function of the workplace, and it works on both sides. People kind of underestimate what they can do when they work here. But with the next slide, I also thought that finally this was an opportunity to explain to people what I do or do not discuss when I go on site meetings, with what I'm looking at in a project. When I was at school with Anne, I read Christian Norberschul's chapter on natural place. And I felt that it really succinctly, although it's a very tough read, succinctly sort of described everything about the aspect of designing space or place from the perspective of experience. Something that 30, 40 years later, I'm dating myself, but there we go, is very much almost like a standard. But at that time, this was unusual thinking. And next slide. That chapter can be boiled down to some very simple language, which has to do with the experience of up and down, in and out, near and far, big and small, whether or not, and this is what distinguishes landscape from architecture, whether or not there is the perceived or the absence of horizon, because you want to know where the earth meets the sky. And the line between, which is where you are in the space. So next slide. We understand this in terms, landscape architecturally, in terms of earth and sky, shelter and exposure, closeness and distance, vastness and intimacy. Again, where places where the earth meets the sky, and the sense of threshold. And so regardless of the type of project that we get, except unless it's like a super highway or something, and even then it sort of comes into it, we are looking for why there is a particular attachment to natural place. We're looking for the reasons for it. We're looking for the stories beneath it. And for me, what's great about Weeksville and what we try to carry through with all of our projects, and definitely the three that we'll talk about today, is looking for a sense of earth. So analytically, I'm coming to a project and looking at the program and looking at the aspirations from the standpoint of looking for a sense of earth. Next. Oh, it didn't make it out. Okay. So with Weeksville, there were actually two aspects to the original scope. There was the restoration of the Hunterfly Road houses. Are we calling them homes now? Homes are houses. The Hunterfly Road homes. That how the visual record and the documented record actually reflected the granular aspects of community life in Weeksville, and what we could do to make sure that visitors to the site were able to emotionally, viscerally experience this. Now, I want to make it clear that I don't subscribe to the idea that you can make people feel a certain emotion. But people will have some sort of experience. What that experience is and what they do with it is up to the individual. But you can aim through the devices that we do, through form, through space making, to aim at some aspect of experience. And so we looked at a range of things. Next slide. Next slide. First of all, we looked at the physiographic history of Kings County. That its relationship to its geomorphology, its glacial history, its agricultural history, its urbanization at the end of slavery, and what those nuances actually were, because we tend to be taught history or consume history in a sort of schematic fashion. So to really understand in the documentation what certain phrases or elements meant, that sort of gives you the more complete picture of how a community is founded, what the faces, challenges that it faced, the opportunities it seized, the standards that it set, the norms that it sort of established, everything that we actually understand as culture, that all of these things that give a community a sense of group identity. You begin to pick this up in a lot of different places of evidence, I would say. So for instance, the Hunterfly Road, when I looked at the maps of the Hunterfly Road, I suspected that the drainage pattern of the Fresh Creek contributed to the pathway of this road. And it turns out that that's a pretty good assumption. And so from a physical standpoint, the drainage has a certain sort of characteristic. Water always runs to the lowest point. It continues to run to the lowest point. And using drainage pattern as wayfinding is something that lends a certain poetry to the idea of how historically people navigated before the grid system, before cell phones, right? So when you begin to understand that this was an actual tracing on the land, as a landscape architect, you get kind of excited. so, and then how over time, as the political interest in Brooklyn began to expand, what we now know as our current grid, and how many of the farm roads were abandoned and closed off and paved over and redeveloped, you begin to understand the impact of that kind of loss of communities, first of all, across the county and specifically here, what that impact meant in terms of land ownership, land occupancy, generational connection to space, all of these things go into it. So you can see even with the historical line of the Hunterfly Road leading all the way up past Atlantic Avenue, that the grid had already begun to disrupt the historical sense of space that existed before. Next. This atlas map predates the previous image. You can see that urbanization was sort of nascent at that time, but you can also see the patterns of land ownership from the colonial settlement, that the angle of that settlement, the orientation of that settlement differed from the street grid as we know it. And it's an interesting and curious point as to why the farm grid wasn't used to lay out the street grid, but that's a conversation for another time. What that means, next slide, is that these structures that remained on the Hunter-Flyer Road, we like to say like they sort of fought for their lives, right? Because Brooklyn developed around it. The more substantial wooden structures were definitely built around. And then those more substantial structures were taken down and these houses remained. And so the whole aspect of the Hunter-Flyer Road houses being strung like a necklace on the site and being off grid was very, very important to their survival. So in trying to create a physical context for the story of Weeksville, it became important not just to talk to the executive directorship at that time and the institutional capacity development, but actually have a sense of what Brooklyn felt like at the turn of the 20th century when there were more photographs. And in the course of working on Weeksville and another project, because Weeksville begat a lot of projects in this area for us, what then happened is that we understood that people labored in semi-enslavement long after emancipation. And when you look at photographs, you can't necessarily make an assumption about the status of the person in them, but they experienced this landscape. Just south of here, it was very flat, it was very open. You could see far, there was this sense of vastness. All of these things that when I talked about the Norbergschel sort of elements of place, you begin to see it. And so in telling the story here, even though we looked at the historical atlas and saw that woodland forest came all the way up to the Hunter-Flyer Road, there was a decision that we were going to open this up in reference to the change in land use at the time that these houses were built when they first started. Similarly, this image was taken in the 60s. My family lived on Bergen Street until 1960, for instance. And my mother, when I told her I was working on this project, she knew the houses. So there is a connection even with my family, which is from the Caribbean, to this place in Brooklyn and to this existence and to this woman with the wonderful cat-eye glasses, right? So you begin to see how a variety of different scales are sort of coexisting at the same time. And you want to make sure that in your design, you are protecting the scale around the houses within a very urban context, as it turns out. So there were a couple of things that also set Weeksville apart as an interpretive project. First, and like I said, just to backtrack for a second, the houses were the historic restoration process, and we looked at a lot of archival documentation to try and determine what the historic landscape scope would be. But at the same time, in terms of the interpretive scope, we knew that we wanted to make sure that people understood that there was a farm grid and then a contemporary grid. And what we used as a datum for establishing the farm grid was actually the two houses that are sort of orthogonally organized to that yellow band. And we used the spaces between the buildings as the dividing line between areas that would be post-shade or developed with shrub massing and which areas would be open. We also knew that from experience that because of the one-way circulation, when you came up St. Mark's and then you made the turn on Buffalo and you were going to make the turn on Bergen, the site opened up in such a way that you could see the houses in the distance. And the urban renewal site, where the houses were taken down, had a sort of rough textured, informal topography to it that lent it this sort of rustic air. So the site itself had a sort of rusticated quality to it, although it was never a rustic site, right? You know, so there are these contradictions that as a designer you start to make decisions about, right? So we had this shaft that was open. We had the framing of that view that was very important from the second multi-purpose space lawn, right? And with that, we had the trajectory of the Hunterfly Road as the historical documents laid it, and then how the modern landscape actually extended into an exchange with the modern building. So you can see that there's sort of extensions of the architectural space out, and that sort of just organized the site. And here you can see that we essentially built the diagram. What we did do in terms of ensuring that the Weeksville experience wasn't flat was that we wanted from that important view to set up a sense of foreground, midground, and background. And so what we did was two things. We decided to interrupt the very gradual sort of direct slope from the high point at the corner of Buffalo and St. Mark's to the low point on Bergen Street by mounding up and then grading backwards. So we created this cut where all the wildflowers are, and as a means of setting up that foreground, midground, and the houses are the background, right? So this is why Weeksville feels larger than it is. This is all of these design. It gives us a horizon. Exactly. And we were able also to use these elements to define the Hunterfly Road, not with paving, but again by berming and then cutting the two places along the walkway so that you naturally walk along the Hunterfly Road to get to the houses. And that there's a modern precinct and then there's a historic precinct. So that's why the berm is necessary. You need and yes, I am sort of measured for the next slide. And so, you know, this project, we worked on this project a long time. It's been in the office well over 20 years. And we started it before Rhino and all these other things. And so we heard about this thing called SketchUp. And so we built a model during the construction phase because we saw that the contractor wasn't interpreting our design intent. And so what we did in a very old school way was that we built this model and then we cut and exported contours at 3-inch intervals. And that's why the grading plan is also very descriptive of the landscape. And the contractor said, I've never received instructions like this ever for a grading plan. And it's worked, okay? So next. And it also became the sort of confirmation of the planting. So in all the processes, which are essentially pretty basic to landscape architecture, actually lent itself to a very sophisticated solution here. And there's the foreground, the midground, and the background. And last year's photograph, Weeksville on its website has the iconic view of the houses across the wildflowers, but we were out here last year working with the grounds crew and administrator and thought that this was a good update for us. We also, you know, this project is so wonderful that, you know, you can go online and Google it and you can see how ordinary people respond to the site. And so we just pulled images of what visitors had taken, and there are thousands. So that's also proof of concept and proof of the pudding, but also really very gratifying and confirming. And even the way Shakaya's sculpture is sort of discovered and rediscovered has been a surprise to us and a surprise to clients. One of the things I want to just sort of end discussion in Weeksville with was the idea that other than arriving at the spaces, we did not specifically program. We left the spaces open to interpretation, in part because I don't believe that experience can be dictated, or interpretation of experience can be dictated. But also because we just wanted it to be humble, to be sort of open. And what has happened is that people have approached Weeksville in thousands of inventive ways to reimagine their own concept on the site. And this is an example of I always forget, is it dancing in the streets, right? Dancing in the streets, literally dancing in a dance performance, dancing through the high grasses as a culmination of a performance. And I guarantee you, we did not anticipate that during the planning stage. Nor did we really anticipate the red maze with the fishbowl in the middle, but we were happy to see that. Now, I explained that Weeksville sort of gave us the visibility to and I would say the credibility rather than the credentials at that time to work on cultural interpretive sites. And so this goes to our collaborations with a number of really smart, really talented architects. Working with Caples Jefferson here was a very specific, very direct experience. Working with Rodney Leon. Rodney has a very different approach to projects, very different vocabulary of thinking about things, very, very keen interest in the application of symbol. Sarah Neverato, no, right? so how you have to, as a business owner, as a consultant, as a leader of young staff, to be able to address the aesthetic ideas of each individual architect and work in complement with them. And so for the burial ground, which was a much smaller site, it's much more concise. We had a technical challenge that we wanted to address a certain way. If you know about the burial ground, you know that the burials took place on the collect pond, which by the time it was used, it had moved away from its bucolic use to an almost semi-industrial, marginalized use. And that landscape in its, I almost want to say, I don't want to say neglect because people did not neglect their burials, but the land itself was not deemed valuable. That when the remains that had been removed during the construction of Ted Weiss building were returned to the site, they were returned in a 9-foot wide by 60-foot long slot in specially carved sarcophagi. If you've worked on any cemetery project, you know that over time the coffins collapse.
Right.
So we specifically designed this to collapse. That's why the land is mounded, so that it anticipated the eventual collapse, and then it would become even more interesting, but it would do that. But Rodney saw the mounds and he said, oh, I love the idea, and they mean this and they do that. And he and the National Park Service stabilize them so that they will never collapse. So you need to be in on every meeting, right? Yeah, and those were the mounds as they were reconstructed. And in the next image, even more recently, working on a strategic plan for the city of Buffalo, the Michigan Street African American Heritage Corridor. One of the challenges that in working with Moody Nolan, I think we stepped up to was to figure out strategies for preserving what we felt was a very strong pride of place in Western New York that is very particular to that landscape. And again, it goes back to the vastness, the open sky, and how a community that had been decimated over time and then industrialized and then made vacant and is looking at redevelopment, how it can preserve the original attachment to place in the strategic development of the site by even investing in maintaining that, let's say, decrepitude as open space. Right? So this brings us to something that you and I worked on, right? That you were my client, right?
The city, the people of New York. The people of New York.
Right, in construction, which is the Peninsula Live Work campus. And this was a project that was both technically challenging for a number of reasons, but also spiritually challenging because it was addressing a site that was a locus of community trauma, strong community trauma. And in over three phases, it's being redeveloped as a mixed-use live-work campus in Hunts Point, New York, the Bronx. And in the course of this, next slide, you can see for a 5-acre site, there will be 5 buildings, and the site is activated over 50 feet of elevational grade change. So that there were technical issues that we used to drive the design issues. We wanted to make sure that accessibility was truly universal to the greatest extent, so that the porosity of the site was maintained and the community could flow in at any time. Next slide, please. And here's the plan that Justin might remember, where in phase 1, there is a sort of grand staircase that links the first elevation to a sort of larger plaza platform. But there's, in this instance, and it's the only instance, there's a publicly used building that has elevators as conveyance systems. The design really aims to use the need to really zigzag through the site in order to surmount these heights as a driver of the patterns and the carve outs for green space. When we were working particularly with the community in the early stages, we were concerned that there'd be a lot of hardscape on this project, because we know that from casual observations of park use on public holidays, that bit of green that you can claim for yourself was really important. And we wanted to make sure that the Bronx, in particular, with its sort of shallow soils and rock outcrops, were sort of represented in our approach to this. So development projects have very aggressive schedules, and we were trying the old-fashioned way to make sure that we could address the quality of space through a lot of drawing and we're trying to make sure it didn't look like Lincoln Center. That was really important to us. And studies about illumination and security and safety, and again, accessibility. So it's being constructed as we speak, and they are finalizing. We should be able to go out in a couple of weeks and actually get pictures of trees with leaves on them. Yeah. That's our grand
this kind of stairs very Bronx, right? Yeah.
It's very Bronx, right? The step street is very Bronx. Yes, it is. Yes, and just closing with a rendering, an early rendering. So in the third, this is probably the most, I want to say, intellectually engaging project that we've had since Weeksville. But and I'm not saying that as a SAP. This is a very special project. We've been asked by the Bowery Residents Committee to address a project where they, in their due diligence, discovered that there had been an enslavement burial site on a development their site was at one time used for enslavement burials, but it also was adjacent to demonstrated Lenape occupation and archaeology. And there was a sincere and concerted effort to reach out to both the Lenape and the African American community to see how a commemorative space could honor both histories. So we are the landscape architects, but we were retained as the project managers. And I had the honor of assembling the team. I'm working with Jacqueline Gardner, Mark and I are working. Stefan sort of checks in, and with Chris Cornelius of Studio Indigenous. And we're advised by Peggy King-Yorda and Joe Baker, respectively. It's been very interesting because the language that we use, the assumptions that we make, even in trying to be, I would say, cognizant and diligent, the approaches to the individual traumas of each community, the idea of celebration of each community, the debate as to whether or not the stories would be told together or separately on a space that is, it might be, I don't even think it's the size of this room, including the exterior. All of that had fallen under our, I don't want to say management as much as facilitation. And part of it was simply creating safe spaces where people could speak candidly. And out of that, we've had, this is just a map of the settler, the Dutch settler interments, and then the interment site in Solid. First of all, I should step back just for a second and explain that the project was spurred, among other things, by the record of the interments, but also the attitude towards the treatment of remains at the turn of the 20th century. You can see that there were amateur archaeologists there who began to collect bones and essentially just stockpile them in a way that is disrespectful and carries harm in and of itself. This is the building. It should be said that BRC has a very progressive approach to providing shelter for people who are experiencing homelessness, and the engagement with the community, inviting the community in and exchanging is a very large part of their mission and service delivery. And so this space was to be a community space that was both for the larger community, but equally for the shelter. It had to be thought of in that way consistently. And that was the enlarged plan shows that. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, go back to one slide. That it showed that from a building code perspective, it means that the secondary egress had to access the external courtyard. And so there's now a ramp proposed within it. And we said, well, okay, if we have to have the ramp, then the ramp needs to really be a ramp. And so in our proposal, the ramp actually has expanded its function and meaning. And it becomes an opportunity of seating, of engagement, and sort of like the first sort of spatial organizer within space. We also sought to eliminate the boundary at the lowest level between the interior and the exterior. Yeah. So in our thoughts, since we had to ramp down about 30 inches, we thought, well, if we're talking about interments, why don't we try to go as low as we can go? And we've actually been able to go down 6 feet. And with that proposal, the idea that your sight lines within this space are also controlled as part of our ambitions for the site. And here we have this diagram where we're forcing the ceiling down to follow the ramping in such a way that when you enter the space, your focus is down. And then when you get to the lowest level, it then opens to the light. So both Mark and Chris were very interested in aspects of the decorative arts, particularly beading in both traditions as a means of exploring materiality, texture, color, spatial adaptation in this project. Part of it is because, both Chris and Joe Baker have as part of their exhibits of their work this sort of spectacular turkey feather cave, right? And I'd hoped to have it as part of this, but it wasn't available, with extraordinary beating in one instance. And Mark and Jacques Gardner in here pick up on this motif and this example as a first step in materiality. They also looked at traditional Lenape and modern Lenape interpretations of clothing, of garments, of beadwork, bandoliers, and how these and other textures, culturally African, broader sort of contextual ideas, and my idea, the earth floor, right, could be brought into a space like this to give it the quality of interpretation. So again, here's the building department filing, drawing, and here is the plan with both the floor plan of the interment commemorative space and the Lenape celebration element as well. And in a larger sense, when we get into the model studies, you can see how these two come together. So one of the concerns we've had is among other things how major the expression will be, and Chris's element is at least the height of the 4-story building, and we're exploring extending the height in and of itself. But you can see, and this isn't quite right, that Mark's interpretation of the space itself also has a decorative intensity that sort of gives mass to, again, those spatial things that we were looking at in the studies. So again, this is just how the elements begin to relate to each other. The sacred space wall, we decided that we were going to extend it all the way into the courtyard space as a datum. And it has within it a portal that is singularly directed. It's not a window, it's a portal. And when you look at it, it directs your view very specifically to a point within sacred space. So here, Mark has used the beading concept, the idea of the braided rope elements, black granite, reliquary urns, and the earth floor to start to explore that space with the transparency at the threshold. Yep. And again, the idea that the ceiling lows, but it's not sort of like the oppressive way of doing it. Yeah. And this axon explains how the elements come together. Similarly, Chris also looked at ornamentation, garments, the Delaware Lenape traditional coat beading and ornamentation, the pattern. Yeah. And again, to the bandoliers, particularly Joe Baker's work. You know, it's nice to have like 7 artists on the project, but you know, Joe is so thoroughly, I don't want to say versed, but it's so thoroughly expressive of Lenape culture that his involvement in the project has been such an asset. And he and Chris have worked together on the interpretation of Lenape's spirit in this sense. So Chris's initial sketch of what was possible for this element and its expressiveness and its assertion, I would say, on the site is really important. And how my challenge is how the ground plane begins to meet all of this, and I'm talking about that in a split second. But these are the initial sort of studies of the form. He does a fair amount of work with perforated metal, perforated materials, and he's looking at patterns of perforations that can be interpreted. And in this instance, he picked up again on some of Joe's work in bandolier and how that would be translated into building material. So these are his preliminary studies of how the element sits and its translucency in terms of its material quality in the space. So this leaves me now, right? Having brought the team together and convened and set up all the Zoom sessions. Where does a landscape come in, particularly since it started with landscape? And for me, again, the issues that we have of the Norfolk sort of elements, and then how this is interpreted or disrupted by some of the architectural moves is now my challenge. So now my deep dive is into African American, enslaved African, Lenape material culture to see how these things come together, and modern technologies, next slide, such as rammed earth, to see how we can arrive at perhaps a level of abstraction that's sort of unified and distinguishing as well. That's it.
Great.
Is there any time left?
Yeah, no, we have time. Yeah, we have time. We have about maybe 20 minutes or so for a conversation, and then we'll open things up to our audience as well for Q&A. So folks, while you're following the conversation, you're welcome to enter questions in the Q&A in the Zoom function, and so I'll be moderating. But first, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing really such a wide spectrum. And when we were putting this conversation together, there's this idea of the different phases and stages of work. So we're lucky to be here in one of the built projects, a long time, 20-year plus engagement on a built project. We had something that's in construction with Peninsula Project on the boards, and the kind of the early planning work that you're doing in Buffalo. So this sort of spectrum of work is really important to think about practice. And this conversation in a way is a continued conversation that we've been having about practice. And I really appreciate first that Ray shared this video of the young people coming to this place and listening to it, learning from it, experiencing it. It's something that I just appreciated from your talk that I hadn't really understood before. And now, we're sort of, from our view, we can look out to the landscape for folks on Zoom, but the idea of the ground, like the power of the ground, the connection to place, letting the ground speak, as some would say, or letting the earth speak, is a powerful way for our communities to speak, right? So this landscape becomes a place that people come to, and they can learn their history, of course, but they also can speak, right? They can create new history, create new forms of power. So it's really powerful seeing that across the work that you share. So the way we thought we would do this, it'll be a little bit of a lightning round approach here, but we wanted to really walk through each of these projects with sort of a prompt. So first, starting with, the completed project, and you mentioned that this was also your PhD, something that you learned quite a bit from, but you're also building your practice. And I'd imagine a lot of the folks in the audience are people that are in some form engaged in practice, maybe having their own practice, working within a practice, and trying to find their agency and power within their work. So what would you say from this long-term engagement with Weeksville, this 20-year process, what has your practice sort of learned from this community and from this place that you think might be sort of a valuable takeaway for people to think through their own?
I think that Weeksville was one of the instances where we had the chance to diverge or digress from the traditional charrette model as a means of information gathering.
It's a big one.
And there was it's a huge one. It's a huge one. But what we started this 25 years ago, whenever it was, and even now, the sort of collective approach to community gathering. It to me, it wasn't addressing any of the qualitative issues that underlay the story, underlay the approach, anything like that. And if you live a peripatetic life, and I have, and if you live long enough, and I have, you know, you kind of you're able to stitch together an approach or a methodology that hinges on a lot of advice that might not be from the design industry.
Right.
So I once met a man who sold African art to Picasso. That was by accident, right?
That's a whole other,
That's a whole other story.
Conversation.
But you know, I'm there with my high school friends and I'm trying to follow along. And it was just me and him for like 4 hours in his gallery. And he said, you have to always pay attention to popular culture because that's where the information actually is. So that has always been in my back pocket, right? Always, but popular culture is very broadly defined, right? So you can't assume that everything is hip hop or, you know, so how you begin to respectfully listen and identify elements in the story and also keep yourself out of the story, your projections, your thoughts, right? Without feeling that you will lose authorship, because I think that's one of the fears. People think if they're not up in there, they don't get to be the author of a solution. So that sort of, that discipline was honed here. Now, listening without judgment came from a Black women's feminist group that you would sit together and people would say things with confidence and openness, and you had to listen without judgment. So listening without judgment is a learned skill, but
Oh, yeah.
but we had to learn it, and I insist that the staff learns it. People go, why do I have to learn? But anyway, they have to learn it, right? And maybe now that they have the video, they understand. But listening without judgment, without projecting, without overriding, without assuming that your way is the way, right? At the same time, you have to balance that with technical expertise. You can't come to the table as an ignoramus. You're not going to know everything, but you need to have the skills to be able to properly research, right? Now, there's a person sitting in my office here whose research skills, her thoroughness far outweighs mine. You run a firm where you balance things. Not everybody's going to be able to do everything, but you have to set certain standards. And so the standards of excellence are an actual engagement, which come from different models, right? So like the first time I met a psychotherapist who told me that they were in therapy, I'm like, why are you in therapy? And I said, Liz, we can't put our stuff on the patient. We can't put our stuff on the client. Mm-hmm. And particularly when you're working with clients who are struggling to be heard in the first place. So your job is to create safe space for your staff, for your client, for their funder, for whoever. It's a different, yeah. It takes a different, I think, schedule. You know, the aggressiveness of practice right now stands at odds with what this is. But you have to figure out a way to make it worth it.
Yeah, that's so wonderful to hear. And, you know, especially like the charrette model. And we, you know, within practice, there's what's in your scope of work, or your contract for what you're paid to do, especially with kind of community and public projects that typically gets a pretty limited resource and limited time. In the charrette model that we're all sort of taught in school, right? It's a Eurocentric, you know, kind of practical.
We tend to trust what's codified, right?
Right.
You know, and sometimes people demand codification, and even in the RFP response, they said, you know, we have to write down So we don't know that yet. We don't know what's going to be there. And a firm like mine, I mean, we struggled for a long time by telling people we don't know until we get started. That would make people very nervous. They want to know what it is that they're buying, right? And so one of the issues is that the past 2 years have changed that narrative, changed that understanding. So in the public, the kids taking to the street have changed the narrative for a firm like me. just hope I can survive.
Right. And also the other thing that reminds me of listening to pop culture. So for those that haven't seen it, Pierre Moss did a fashion show here, I would call it, kind of within the kind of popular culture, because it's on the cover of Vogue magazine, right? Like this landscape, is in that sort of space, and being able to speak to a wider range of people shows that there's a different skill set needed, frankly, or what you mentioned with the art dealer. So that's an important frame for our work as designers. I do want to move on to the next frame, which we had, which was shared that the Peninsula Project was in construction, and I love seeing some of the photos. I was very curious about the stairs. So I was very happy to see the images, and like, okay, it worked.
It's even in code.
Yeah, we were totally positive, but kind of, in that project, you had so many different competing interests. Like you said, it was a site of trauma, harm, a lot of expectations on that project delivering economic benefit for community, social benefit, environmental, we want some green. As that's been actually built and now you're kind of making it real, what are some of the things that are maybe still evolving or kind of coming up as challenges as you're actually building these ideas?
One is kind of interesting in a almost non-technical way, or it's a different technical way. It's that, when you build in the public sector, when you build large projects, your specifications have to be really tight. And we were placing a lot of rocks. And I won't say that the first time around that we wrote the spec in such a way that the rocks could be what we expected. And Eleanor and I have had a lot of conversations since then as to how the next phase, the specification has to be written so that we have a certain type of rock and finish.
Your 3-inch contour.
But also, I had said, well, this vendor sells these kind of rocks. We want these kind of rocks. And so the level of expertise that is the due diligence that's needed to do. The Peninsula was really like the litmus test for that. I mean, the second phase is really both challenging and interesting because the half of the site is on a roof deck, a shallow roof deck, right? And then half of that roof deck actually slopes because it's a garage ramp. And so how you do all of these things, the technical aspects of stabilizing. So one of my concerns is you have a situation where people want a Weeksville. They want the softness. They want the right. But this is a very edged hardscape, and I'm
really
nervous about that. It's really a roof. It's really a roof that's steep in all different directions. And because it's a roof, and you're using this granular growing medium that is so limited, you really have to constantly keep up with industry trends and see who's doing what to see how they solve something so that you can come back and so you have to build that sort of flexibility into your process.
Yeah, I appreciate that project and all of its complexities and there are so many forces on that project, the affordability of the housing, the need for all the kind of programmatic challenges. So that landscape is really responsible for tying together a lot of competing interests. And so I just really appreciate how much work it was to make this, what's really in that case, it's sort of a constructed surface that is being asked to really do way too much, honestly. But you've really done a wonderful job in that project to kind of stitch together what really were major needs in that community and kind of long deserved kind of investment in the place, right? In again, kind of in the ground of that. Moving on to the next one, the Inwood Sacred Site. we always say places are never empty. That image of the burial I have not, or the people digging up the burials. Wow. So places are never empty, and you're working with this ground. And I loved hearing that the earthen material is something that you want to give people access to, right? To better understand that place, and it's a small place. But you showed, right, that this is a kind of a cross-disciplinary collaboration. So artists, multiple architects, which is already a challenge for multiple architects. Use landscape, and then of course the client and the people that the client are serving, sort of coming together within a very small space.
Very dense. It's a very dense
very
project.
dense project.
Yeah,
Very New York. But I'm sure a lot of the people have done these small but big projects before. Right? So small space, seemingly small project, but there are all these layers. How are you sort of thinking through and navigating that in this on the boards stage to kind of work through, the kind of the power of space in sort of smaller scale?
Well, you do have to make some strategic decisions, and I want to say live with the consequences. Right? You know this, that there are clients who hire architects to design monuments, and monuments are they're very specific, right?
Oh, yeah.
So we went into the process spending several weeks just trying to figure out what was this space going to be? Were we going to deliver program space that had symbolism, or were we going to deliver an art space that you occupied to be in the space and be in these stories, right? And you have to make sure that people don't wander. People in one camp don't wander into the other, because then you get a lot of nothing, right?
Right.
So I think that a certain sort of commitment early to parameters within the approach, which is still open, is very necessary.
Yeah, that living with consequences, that's a really important and powerful, almost ethical framing, right? That sometimes designers don't fully take that responsibility, frankly.
They don't call back.
Right? Like the building's done, you walk over, it's right. You could have just walked away from this, and people are trying to figure out the project long term. And it's like, cut the hill down so we can have a bigger party. It's understanding that that's an ongoing process, right? That changes over time, like the consequences building up and layering on a place or a site. So that's important kind of ground. The next scale that you had introduced, it was sort of brief in the presentation, but I thought it was really important because I think it showed the kind of the aggregation of your work, kind of what you're known for in your work with the Buffalo project. In that case, you're in this early stage of really setting the parameters for the future of development of a place. That's the urban designer and planner is really interested in, of course, in that phase and step of work. In that process, so you're a smaller firm, someone that's defined as a landscape firm, but you're reaching across and engaging some really serious conversations about the future of a city, the future of a neighborhood. How do you sort of navigate that kind of work? I think it's something that a lot of designers, probably the kind of designers that would tune into this kind of talk, might be interested in that, right? Your scope is this, but your responsibility or your interests, right, are much broader. How are you navigating that?
Well, it's actually the thread through all of the projects, and it's really our part of our approach, if not the element of our approach. Right? And again, I go back to the Norfolk Schultz writing as the sort of basis for my take on site analysis, so that all of these other incoming things, no matter what they are, right, are sort of filtered through the lens of at the end of the day, how is this experience status? So that's a disciplinary sort of constraint or framework that I set for myself and my team.
Right, how to stay in your lane.
How to make sure that what was that scraping noise? that thing. But what's happened is that over time, I think I've learned to articulate these things better. And so the conversations that I have with clients, and I loved working with Don David Pierre at we had great conversations. We were, if not on the same, always on the same page, but definitely simpatico, we sort of, and so the project evolved that those solutions were not quick, right? So Weeksville wasn't quick.
Still not quick.
Peninsula, relatively speaking, is quick, right?
Right.
Inwood Sacred Sites sort of straddles this. I think BRC would like us to step up because they want to make sure that whatever happens with the larger building, which is going forward,
Right.
But we didn't start to hone in on advocating for certain decisions, because that's what the strategic plan is to sort of advocate for certain decisions. And it's different from a master plan where there's already a commitment to some sort of idea. These are the broader issues. These are your options. Each of these consequences could be different, and this is how they can be envisioned. So it's a little different.
More of a framework.
It's more of a framework, right? So in one sense, we kind of had the freedom to fantasize about what this could be, but we also got to focus on, again, what was essential, right? So for instance, in that image that I showed, there is a boardwalk. It's not the only boardwalk of that type that's ever been designed, but it actually comes from the need to have all of these historic structures. I didn't really explain that this area of Michigan Street is actually where 4 historic assets, sort of the core of the community identity, right? And so one of the concerns is, how would redevelopment impact, or these turn of the 20th century structures, none of which are ADA accessible. So the floor of the nave and all of these other things are like up in the air, and so the idea is that if you get people to a certain elevation, you'll be able to connect them to the historic structures at a certain elevation. It creates this organizing element that then puts everything else in place. Now that's design, right?
I love that.
Right?
Yeah.
But that was like, suddenly when we were able to push to make that connection, I'm not even sure that the client understands that's what we did. They just like the outcome. That we were able then to say, okay, this is what has to happen in order to tie together your assets in a way that everyone can appreciate them. And of course, access them. And so, landscape architects love to change grade. They love boardwalks. They love to put people, on the skywalk. This type of thing. So the fact that we could advocate for this was just like the cherry on the cupcake. That was so
But I love that because it's a step back conversation. That there's a broader kind of public realm, public space, public infrastructure conversation. So you're not asking each individual building site to solve the problem, right? How to become accessible, for example, right? The architecture doesn't have to take on all of that in 4 different sites. There's one collective thing that could be done to think about how do we make this history more accessible, engaging, and available to people. I think that's a really wonderful thing to have at that larger, almost planning strategy scale conversation, because if it just simply put in the bullet point on the PowerPoint, right? Accessibility, and then you have 4 different people, 4 different solutions with 4 different buildings, you probably don't actually get what would be understood as a more universal access to
Right.
that history.
Right.
I love that. So we're closing out in time. We do have some Q&A from our audience.
Nice.
So I will read through a few of these. So we have Wendy Bertrand, who's asking, what do you think could be taught in environmental, landscape architecture, and architecture schools to increase some of the social issues that it seems that you're well versed at understanding the staging? What did you wish you were taught in school?
Well, I didn't mention that my undergraduate degree was in environmental psychology. And nor did I mention that after doing 3 years of behaviorist sort of intentionality, my last professor in the program was the one who raised it. He said, listen, you can't predict how people are going to respond. And on a podcast recently, I said, what was the last 3 years about, right? But that eye-opening statement, there are things that programs can do, okay? But the idea that the program is going to do everything is, I think, naive. I think in life, you need to work a year in a crappy job. I think you need to travel, and not just as a tourist, but to be in a place long enough that you have to adapt, right? All of these life skills inform practice, right? I would like to say that there's a certain eccentricity here, and there's also a certain Jamaicanness here, and there's a lot of other things that go into the mix. But it also happens to be that I grew up with a certain financial, I don't want to say instability, but there was never a lot of money. And so I'm able to run a company because money isn't the issue. Although money is the issue, right? What I'm saying is that, and somebody asked me, how are you able to do this? And I'm not afraid to be broke. If this means that I can do, I don't advise it. The reason why we're not a nonprofit, right? Which sort of brings a certain sort of structure to the questions that we're asking, is because I believe that the private sector should be able to charge for these services. This is one, and be paid. So this is one of the things that I'm advocating for. But there's a thing called home training, right? So you also have you have to start young to broaden your exposure and your acceptance of ideas that are not necessarily ones that you're comfortable with. One of the things that I find very challenging in general is that I don't see people kind of like trained in scientific method, like, to compare anything. I learned the basics, compare and contrast, right? So you can always like, okay, this will happen or this will happen. When we were doing public work, this doesn't seem to be the case now because things, I guess, have changed, but we used to have to come up with 3 separate alternative design alternatives, right? And it wasn't 3 variations on a theme, it was 3 separate alternatives. All I'm saying in answer to this question is that you actually have to understand that these are broad questions, and that training for broad questions means that you have to be versed in the fundamentals. You cannot leapfrog over the fundamentals to get to these exotic sort of bigger issues. You have to understand, you have to crawl before you walk. Right? Now, do you have to specialize in one thing? No, but you have to have the tools that allow you to continue to educate yourself as you go on.
Right.
I didn't do historic preservation when I was in school. I didn't do sustainability when I was in school. I didn't do, but I had, basic ecology. So Personally, what I do, and this goes back to the business of popular culture. If I'm going into something new, I start with popular literature. I start with magazines. So I can build up a vocabulary that allows me to access the more detailed, sophisticated information. I don't go there because I'll never get out of there. Right? But I kind of like, okay, that's why popular mechanics exists.
Right. Love that. We'll do a very short, quick round, one sentence kind of answer. So of all the gifts shared and received while visiting beloved Weeksville, what do you see as the biggest reward gained from this place? And that's from Janelle.
Oh, a sense of self.
A sense of self.
A sense of self. Everardo Jefferson talks about walking here in the post-construction, whatever, and somebody came, and the site things were not where they were now. And he said, this is ours. It's a sense, and even people who are not Black who come here understand, they come away with an understanding of self.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth.
And then offstage was thank you to the Weeksville Center for their great hospitality and allowing us to take this whole room for our small broadcast, and obviously to Elizabeth and Justin for just this incredibly thoughtful presentation and conversation, which I hope continues and that we're all allowed to share in the future. And thank you all very much. We'll see you in June, actually on the second Friday of June with Ken Smith, which will be our last FF for the year.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your Friday.